Hello everyone, this is Jarek Defiler and welcome back to my new series, Games for Non-Gamers, the FPS genre. Last video we took a look at controller and mouse and keyboard settings in Doom 2016. This video we're going to be taking a look at audio and video settings in the same game. So in the audio menu, as you can see, this is a great options menu to have when it comes to audio. You have multiple volumes for different functions, so music, sound effects, voice, and then master volume. This is really great. So in the master volume, this basically controls the volume of all of these. So this controls the entire volume pool in the game. So if we were to max it out, now you can hear those cursor clicks a little bit more. If we were to bring it down, then the entire game is muted. So how does this affect everything else here? If I have the music volume, which is just what it is, you know, basically just the volume of the music, I put this all the way up to 100%. Spooky. The darkness envelops my soul. This is great music, by the way. You guys should definitely check out the soundtrack. It's very heavy metal-ish and very dark and grim and stuff. Very immersive. But since we have this at 100% now, I can take the master volume, move it down, and you can slowly hear the music going away. Because this controls all the volume in the game. So now, not only do you not hear the music, again, you don't hear my cursor movements of the mouse. So that's just a good way to adjust the overall volume as a whole. I'm going to move this music back down because I'm recording. Now the sound effects volume is basically all the volume, or excuse me, all the sounds in the game outside of music and voices. So if you're shooting a gun, or if you're getting shot at, or you hear the demon screaming, or you shoot a barrel and it explodes, that's all going to be covered under sound effects volume. This is perhaps the most important volume setting to have in the game because it directly affects gameplay. Since this is a first-person shooter, and you are always in the first-person perspective, there are going to be times when enemies get behind you, so you might get attacked from behind or get jumped and surprised. This is where the sound effects volume comes into play, so you kind of want this in the higher range, because say you're running forward and all of a sudden you hear a Hell Knight just jump behind you and yell and stuff, and you have to turn around and go, holy crap, I'm going to get attacked from behind. So this is an indicator for all that, so it's very important to have this activated and decently in the high range. And voice volume is just the NPCs will be talking to you and spouting exposition, usually to push a narrative or something to further drive the story. Personally, you know, I don't really care one way or the other if I have this high or low. It's just there if you want to get into the story. I'm not really a story-driven guy when it comes to these kind of games. When it comes to Doom games, it's more about the gameplay mechanics for me than the story, but you know, a lot of people have them. Why not? Or if you're deaf or you just don't want to hear the volume of the voices, then you can always turn them off and then use subtitles. So this basically is just what it sounds like. It just puts the text of the NPCs, what they're saying, there, so you can just read what they're saying rather than hear it. Or you can do both. This is, you know, subtitles are great for recording and whatnot, but overall it's just personal preference, up to you. And it's a good idea to tinker around with this and get a good feel for it. Usually I keep this at 50% while I'm recording, so we'll put that back there. And then we'll move on to the video settings. Now what you'll first notice when opening the video settings menu is that it's a bit more complex than the audio menu. But quite frankly, this is actually pretty standard for most games. Not just FPS games, but most games in general will have these options in the video menu. The field of view is unique to third-person shooters and first-person shooters generally, because it just adjusts the angle and the width of like your view. So usually if like an isometric top-down game won't have this in it, or like a strategy game really won't have this in it. So other than that, the rest of the stuff you can find in pretty much most 3D rendered games, or most games in general. Now starting with the window mode up at the top here, basically this just changes the way the game is viewed on your monitor on screen. So if we're going to click on this, for example, we'll go to window and apply that, give it a few seconds, and then you'll see that the game is now in a Windows Explorer screen. So you'll have the borders around here, and you'll have like the minimize the tray, the escape function up here. This isn't particularly ideal because it does lower your performance and your frame rate a bit, mainly because the computer and your graphics card and all that are saving memory and using memory on your desktop apps that are running on the background, as well as simultaneously running the game itself. So it just takes a little bit more pressure on your hardware. If you're running a high-end machine, kind of like mine, it's pretty high-end, it's not really going to have much of a difference in performance, but it can, especially if you're using a low specs machine. So you might not want to really use that if you have a lower end machine. Borderless is pretty much the same as windowed, except it just gets rid of the border, so it looks a little bit nicer, but the performance is pretty much still the same. So again, you might have a little bit of drop in frame rate depending on your machine. So preferably you would want to go with full screen mode, because that's the most optimal mode for performance, and it basically means that the computer and your RAM and all that and your CPU and your graphics card are all just focusing on the game and only the game. Now moving down to monitors, this is pretty simple. It just basically allows you to select which monitor you want the game to be displayed on. I have 2 monitors here. I just have it displayed on my number 1. A lot of people might just have 1 monitor, so they won't even have the option to switch. Some people, like hardcore gamers or high-end, video editors or music producers, might even have, 2, 3, or 4, or even 5 monitors, depending on how crazy they want to get. So it's just a simple little option. Moving down to aspect ratio, what this is basically the width and height ratio of the image on screen. So 16 by 9 is 16 units by 9 units, so 16 width and 9 height. Usually the bigger number is always the width. Now that everything is widescreen nowadays and HD and all of that, the bigger number is always going to be the width and the smaller number is always going to be the height. Whereas in comparison to like in the 90s where all the monitors were square, the ratio would just be like 1 by 1. So that's how you know the difference. 16 by 10, that's I believe it's just like a little higher widescreen. 25 by 16 is going to be kind of an ultra wide screen. And then you have others like CinemaScope and stuff, or like 21 by 9. So there's just a bunch of different ones, but for standard, it's 16 by 9. Like these are kind of older looks. So like 3 by 2, these are kind of smaller, more squarish ratios, or mostly to do with like cameras and film and stuff like that. But for HD and anything like that, 16 by 9 is pretty much the standard what you're going to want to use. So we can take a look at some of the other aspect ratios that you're probably not going to be using, but like I said before, some of these are used for cameras and things like that. Like 3 by 2, for instance, is a lot of digital cameras and stuff, I think, use it. As you can see, it's pretty funky. It's very small, more squarish. There's a lot of black bars, but the resolution is also lowered a great deal because this is just not meant to be on HD monitors. We can go back to 5.4, for example. Check that one out. And it's a little bit clearer, a little bit bigger, but there's still like black bars on the side. It's still not the proper size because it's just not meant to be on these major widescreen monitors. And it has lower resolution, but the resolution goes up. As you can see, with the higher units of ratio, then generally the resolution also accompanies that, the better resolution rather. So we're going to go back to 16:9 and we're going to adjust to my proper resolution and apply. And now everything is back to normal because, like I said before, this is pretty much the standard for widescreen monitors nowadays. Moving on down to resolution. What the resolution is the amount of pixels or picture element that you have on your monitor on screen. So what a pixel is basically this programmable color unit that as a whole make up the images rendered on the monitor on your screen. Generally, the rule is the higher number of pixels, the better. So I have 2K HD resolution. So this is 2560 pixels width going left to right by 1440 pixels height going up and down. So this is just 2K HD, very good, really good resolution. And again, like I said, the higher number, the better, because it just provides more pixels per square inch, which allows a sharper image and just more clarity. Now I can even go up to the 4K resolution. I think it's 4K. I forget what the actual number for 4K is. It might be 4K, but I don't want to do that because my monitors can't even really support it, so it won't be working that well, and it'll really reduce my performance and everything. Because although my gear can probably handle it on my rig, my hardware, but the monitors I have aren't Ultra HD monitors. They're not 4K monitors, they're just 2K. 4K still kind of in the works. It probably has a lot of tweaking to do before they become optimal. But anyways, the standard right now is 1080. This is kind of what you have on your TVs and whatnot. Most monitors have this. So you can get these monitors for really cheap and whatnot. My monitors were fairly expensive because they're just really good. But the lower the resolution you go, then the worse the image is. For example, we'll go to the lowest resolution here, 1176 by 664. Activate that, and now you can see that the screen is fairly blurry. It's a bit smaller because there's just not as many pixels, showing the amount of light and whatnot. So even though it's on a 2K monitor, the resolution that is being rendered isn't as good. So it looks bad. So make sure you want to have this generally matched with your monitor resolution. So find out the specs on your monitor and then adjust the resolution appropriately. Now, what vertical sync is a preventative technology that basically forces your frame rate and your refresh rate on your monitor to sync. The reason for this is often computer hardware, like the graphics card and CPU and everything, are generally more powerful than your monitor can be. So your computer will pump out more frames per second than your monitor can handle. And what's a frame per second? We discussed that, I believe, in previous video. But a frame per second is how many frames or images can be portrayed on a screen per given second. So 60 frames per second will show 60 images on a screen per second. 120 frames per second will show 120 images per second, etc., etc., etc. With the monitor's refresh rate, what that means is it's usually measured in hertz, and it's your monitor's ability to show those frames. So a 60 hertz monitor will only be able to show a maximum of 60 frames per second because that's its redraw rate. That's the ability for it to constantly show the images. A 144 hertz monitor like mine will be able to show 144 frames per second. But sometimes your computer will be able to pump out way more than that, and that will cause issues called screen tearing. What screen tearing does is when your computer is shoving out so many frames per second that your monitor can't keep up with, it'll start to compensate by cutting some of the frames in half, and it just looks really weird because it basically splits some of the frames, and you'll see these lines kind of cutting the images and stuff, and it could give some people headaches. And that's where vertical sync comes in. It basically puts a cap on the amount of frames that are coming out of your computer in order to coincide with your monitor's refresh rate so that it syncs up nicely. Now, it does have its downsides because it can in fact affect input lag a little bit because you're basically delaying some of the frames that are getting to your monitor. So when you're doing that, you might have some issues with like movement or shooting and things like that. But generally, it's not too big of a deal. Most of the time it works just fine. You only really need it if you have a really high frame rate that is just affecting your ability to be portrayed on your monitor. So here on Doom 2016's option, we have adapted, off, and on. Now off naturally is just going to turn it off. On is just going to keep it on. But this is new from NVIDIA, adaptive VSync. Basically, the VSync will measure and watch your frame rate and your refresh rate. And when your frame rate goes above your refresh rate, vertical sync will kick on and start cutting the frame rates. Whereas if it goes below your frame rate or your refresh rate on your monitor, then vertical sync will shut off. So it's not affecting it negatively in another way, not affecting input lag and things like that. So that's pretty handy to have. Generally, I can just usually keep it on because I always have a really high frame rate because my computer's just really strong, and my monitors are really good too, but my computer is just way stronger than my monitor. So I usually cap out at 144 frames and 144 hertz on my monitors. So usually I like to keep it on. It's up to you. Just depends on how you want to go with it. There are other forms that are out there that are coming out that are better than VSync, like G-Sync and FreeSync from NVIDIA and AMD. But the problem with those is with G-Sync, you have to have not only a graphics card that runs it, but you also have to have a monitor that runs it. So vertical sync is vertical sync. Yeah, it does stink. No, it doesn't. It's pretty great. Vertical sync is the basic default right now for pretty much all games and graphics cards and whatnot. So it's very handy to have if you have problems with screen tearing. Anti-aliasing is a little bit complicated, but basically it smooths out the rough edges on objects, models, and assets in the game. So you have pixels that show up all the light and everything on the screen. They render all the images, but these are all square. So when they're horizontal or they're vertical on an object, they look smooth and fine. But when they're on a round object or an object that has like a curved edge or something like that, they develop this kind of staircase effect because they're stacking on each other diagonally and the squares are going corner to corner to corner, so it doesn't look smooth. This is where anti-aliasing comes in, because that roughness is what's known as aliasing. So anti-aliasing technologies tries to smooth that out, and most of the time it does. You always see here in the options, we have plenty right here, anti-aliasing options. Generally, the rule of thumb is from the top to bottom is going to be the amount of processing power that is required generally. So FXAA is an older one by NVIDIA. It worked good, but it's not as good as, say, TSSAA. The positive of FXAA is that it doesn't require a lot of processing power, whereas TSSAA, especially ATX, requires tons of processing power. So TSSAA stands for temporal super sampling anti-aliasing, and the ATX is basically the multiplier of it, the strength of it, I guess you could say. So the higher the number, these are all 1TX, the higher the number, then the more processing power it's going to take, but it achieves far greater results. TAA is temporal anti-aliasing, so it's pretty much the same as TSSAA, just without the super sampling. So what super sampling is it just takes the color samples from the pixels that you have on the screen, and then it distorts them in a way by creating this high rendered image and then shrinking it down so you get a smoother edge. It's kind of weird, kind of complicated. I don't really understand most of this myself, but just play with it, see which one works for you, see which one your computer can handle, because you know, TSSAA ATX is probably going to take a lot of guts off your hardware. Luckily I can run it because I have a pretty expensive computer, but just play with them and see which one works for you. Lower end computers might have to stick around, you know, FXAA with the 1TX or TAA, but ultimately this isn't, anti-aliasing is pretty nice, but it's not super necessary as much as it used to be, because a lot of modern games have pretty decent resolution and whatnot. But the TSSAA, temporal anti-aliasing, is specifically linked to the frame rate too. So if you have problems with low frame rate and whatnot, then TAA or TSSAA might be better for you, because it helps clean up the images and stuff as a result of the lower frame rate and stuff like that. So it's weird, kind of complicated. You could read up on it if you're interested in the technicalities of it. I'm not so much. I know the basics, but it's very much a thing that's going to be needed to be chosen based on your hardware and what your computer can handle, because it can get kind of pricey from the hardware standpoint, as far as, you know, using your CPU or your GPU and rendering the images and the temperatures going up and frame rates and things like that. So here we have a feature that should be in the video settings of every game ever made, a colorblind mode. I don't have problems with being colorblind personally, but a lot of people do, so it's really cool that this feature is here. Now we look at here, we have three options. We have deuteranopia for those that have problems with green light. We have protanopia for those that have issues with red light. And then lastly, we have tritanopia option for those that have problems with blue light. You know, it's really cool that the devs put this here for a small minority of the population when they probably didn't really have to, but it just shows that they care about their consumer base to a certain degree, and it's always nice to see a colorblind option in any game ever. Now with gamma, a lot of people tend to get it confused with brightness. The difference is that brightness will adjust the overall brightness of all the colors on screen at once. So if you go down in brightness, everything becomes black. If you go up, everything becomes white. With gamma, you're adjusting the brightness, I guess you could say, or the contrast or even saturation of the RGB colors, the red, greens, and blues. You're not really adjusting the blacks and the whites so much. So although, you know, if you go down all the way, as you can see, it does get darker. But you still see the whites and the blacks are still black, and you could even see some colors there. But if you go all the way up, then everything gets lighter, yes, to a certain degree, but you still see black and you still see like regular white, and not everything is super bright like it would be if you're adjusting the brightness. So you're really changing the RGB colors more than you're changing the entire color slash shader spectrum. So that's the difference here. Motion blur is when you run or sprint in a game or move really fast with your thumbstick looking around, and it blurs the side of the screens, kind of like in your peripheral vision. It doesn't look good in my opinion. I don't particularly care for it, which is why I usually keep it off. I think studios are just putting it in there trying to make the games more cinematic-like, more film-like, rather than just being games, you know? So a lot of people might like this. They might like the experience, make it look like a cool action game, or action movie rather. Me, I personally don't think it looks good. I always keep it off. But here you have the option to keep it on, so that's cool. Low, medium, and high. I've looked at it on high, and I honestly didn't really see much motion blur anywhere, so I don't think it's as prevalent in Doom 2016 as it is in other games. But some games it can get like really bad, especially during the campaign, single player campaigns like Battlefield or Call of Duty. The motion blur it gets overwhelming at times because they're just trying to make you have an interactive experience rather than playing a game. So if you dig this kind of thing, then feel free to turn it on. Or if you're like me and you don't particularly care for it, and you can always turn it off. The option is there. That's the good thing. Chromatic aberration is another distorted image option that a lot of developers have been putting in games lately. It's kind of gives the games a 3D look, as if you're looking at your 3D glasses, and it basically distorts the image's color around the edges, so it looks like you can see like red, green, and blue lines at different angles and stuff. I don't know the purpose behind it. It's a distorted effect, and often considered a broken effect when using cameras, and they decided to put it in video games. Not entirely sure why, but I always keep it off because it just, in my opinion, doesn't look good at all. Like I said, I just don't understand the reasoning behind it. But again, the option is there for those that like it, so you can toggle that on and off. I don't really see it too bad in Doom 2016. But I keep it off anyways because there's just no reason I would want it on in the first place. But that's just me. And lastly, we come to, in my opinion, one of the most important options to have in a first-person shooter, the field of view, often abbreviated as FOV. What this does is adjust the viewing angle of the screen, like the width of the screen. So if you go all the way down to 90, which is actually pretty decent default, then the screen basically the viewport becomes smaller in what you can see. Now, if you go crazy and go up to 130, then it gets a little bit of a fisheye effect. It gets really wide, but you can see more along the sides. I tend to stick between the 100 and 110 range, but it's up to you what you might like. I can't really go low because on low fields of view give me headaches after a while. So I have problems with that. A lot of people might get motion sickness from it going too low. A lot of people might also get headaches and stuff like I do. So it's really good to have this option in first-person shooters, and you can have it in third-person shooters too, which is great. Any perspective where you're first person or third person, it's always great to have a field of view option. So tinker around with this to see what you like. If you have problems with headaches and things like that while you're playing games for a little while, then I recommend two things. One is probably adjusting the blue color on your light. Getting that from your monitor tends to lead to headaches, so I would lower the blue light or do a night mode or reading mode or something like that. Or adjust the field of view. If it's a first person or third person game, then increase the field of view and you'll probably see those headaches go away. So that's it for this video. I guess we're all done. Next, we're going to be doing the advanced settings, which is probably going to take a little while because there's a lot in there that's really complex. And thanks for sticking around. I hope you guys learned something. And I hope you have a good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, depending on where you are. This is Jarek Defiler, and I'm out.